Hi, and welcome to the next episode of our Applied Generative AI video series. In this session, we're going to discuss a key recommended best practice for organizations that are adopting artificial intelligence or AI technologies in general, or more specifically, the more recent generative AI technologies like OpenAI or Azure OpenAI. This best practice is to create what's known as a Center of Excellence or CoE organization to help you govern your adoption of AI or generative AI technologies. And the CoE is typically comprised of a cross-functional team that includes not only IT experts, but also business functional representatives and representatives from internal organizations such as legal, talent, or human resources. This cross-functional team will be the central group that will help you both manage and govern your journey in adopting generative AI technologies. Now, since the CoE is a broad topic, we've broken this session into two parts. In this first part, we're going to talk about some of the key considerations for defining the scope of either an AI CoE, or more specifically or more narrowly, a generative AI CoE. We're also going to talk about how we at AIS have experience in both implementing and operating CoEs, and how we can help you stand up a CoE for generative AI as part of your journey to adopt that technology. And then we'll motivate, why would we want to create a CoE? What are those critical business needs and critical risks that really drive us to want to create the Center of Excellence? And what will be some of the benefits from that? So that's what we'll cover in part one. Then in part two, we're going to dive deeper, having kind of set the stage for understanding why we would want to create a CoE. We're going to walk through an example of a CoE operating model that we would recommend, again, based on our experience in standing up CoEs for different clients in the past. And we're going to talk about what are those key capabilities that a CoE should perform or provide to the organization. We'll talk about the team model in terms of roles that you should consider in formulating your CoE. And then we'll conclude part two with a brief section on how, once you've set up the CoE, you should really get started on your journey in adopting AI or Azure OpenAI technologies. So now let's talk about the scope and defining the scope of CoE, particularly as it pertains to generative AI technologies. First and foremost, we have to kind of take a step back and understand that when we talk about generative AI technology, it's really a subset of the much broader artificial intelligence domain. And it's really been born of a series of innovations across not only artificial intelligence, but machine learning and deep learning as well. So when we think about a CoE, we want to think about the capabilities not only from the context of a generative AI perspective, but eventually across all the different components of your AI capabilities. And when we take a look at the stack for Azure AI services, that'll become clear as to why we kind of have to look at both narrowly and broad. For purposes of this presentation today, we're going to focus in on what the capabilities or motivation would be for putting together a CoE to really focus in on that more narrow subset of generative AI technologies. In a future session, we can look then about how you can start from this more narrow definition of a CoE and expand out to cover the larger scope of AI capabilities. This gives you kind of a sense for what we mean when we talk about kind of how broad the topic of AI is within the context of Azure, as well as the industry in general. What you're seeing over here on the right is a list of all the Azure AI services that are currently available in the November 2023 timeframe, right before the upcoming Ignite conference, which will be in mid-November of this year. And what you can see is that Azure OpenAI, which is the primary generative AI service, It's just one of many different services. So when we think about a CoE, we think about the wanting to put together the overall structure of a CoE and defining its scope and its charter. We have to look across these different components and different services to really truly understand kind of where we want to start and what scope we want to set for the CoE. And even beyond this scope, there's the much broader scope of AI capabilities that go beyond just generative AI custom development. And that goes into the new copilots that Microsoft is delivering, from whether it's Windows Copilot, the new Microsoft 365 Copilot, GitHub Copilots, and then the copilots that are part of the Power Platform. Those also eventually you'll want to fold into your overall governance structure within your CoE. And even extending beyond the Microsoft capabilities, when we look further, we see that there are other LLMs that will be eventually available, potentially to use within your organization. So you also kind of have to think about how you're going to govern not only just the Azure OpenAI or OpenAI type models that you'll get through Azure OpenAI, but also those more broad set of models that come from other parties such as Meta or Google. In terms of our experience at AIS in setting up centers of excellence, first and foremost, it's born of our history of adopting emerging technologies over 4 decades. And this spans multiple different types of technologies. We were one of the first adopters of the Azure Cloud. We've been in Azure Cloud for over a decade or more. And we hold many competencies within Microsoft for not only Azure Cloud, but also artificial intelligence in general. And we have direct experience in setting up CoEs for customers, not only for Azure Cloud and how to govern your build out of workloads within the Azure Cloud, but also Power Platform and how you can build out and manage your low code, no code solutions within the Power Platform. And we can take and apply those learnings and those approaches to defining that operating model that I mentioned that we'll cover in part 2 for coming up with how we would manage and govern the build out of solutions around Azure OpenAI. So now let's talk through why we would want to create a Azure OpenAI CoE and what would fundamentally the types of concerns that a CoE would be chartered to address. When we take a look at generative AI, we look at the common concerns or common risks that we see with this technology, you can kind of think of them in 3 broad categories. The first category is in the area of data. These generative AI models really are built around the data that they are given to them, and their operation is really dictated by how they were trained, not only one, from a foundational standpoint, but 2, when you're using these generative AI models in the context of your data, how are you grounding them or actually training them is really a function of the quality of the data that you will give to them. So it's very important that you have governance and controls and practices around making sure that the quality of the data that you bring to these generative AI models is high quality and is complete. Second, and directly tied back to the quality of data, is accuracy and relevance. So it's important to establish guidelines and best practices to manage some of the key risks associated with when you're looking at generative AI solutions. These models, or these large language models, are known to have cases where they will hallucinate or give kind of made up answers to questions that you give to the models. It's important to also have ways of prompting the models to ensure accuracy of the answer that you're seeking or the content you're seeking to generate. So again, these are things that you need to think about organizationally to really help you and guide you towards driving out a good governance structure within the organization. The next 3 really then get more into security, privacy, legal, and what's known as responsible AI. When we talk about responsible AI, it's really all about making sure that when we build out these models, we have guidelines, controls, mechanisms for monitoring the outputs of the content generated by the models to ensure that we're not doing any harm to any individual or any demographic group as part of what's being provided from the model. Similarly, we must make sure that we have good controls for data, that we protect the data, we make sure that the data is not exposed, and make sure that only the right individuals have access to that data. And then third, we have to make sure that when we're building these models and we're bringing in content to that large language model, that we are cognizant of any IP or need to attribute originality, original thought to these particular data sets. So making sure that we're compliant from an IP standpoint. And finally, there's just the general operations of your Azure OpenAI or AI solutions in the form of that you must establish guidelines for managing costs. When you deploy these models, there's different factors that you have to consider from a cost standpoint, and then thinking about how you're going to centrally plan and budget for these different solutions that you're going to build. And then last but certainly not least, there is the aspect of training and change management to really bring your organization into the realm of generative AI and have your organization and the team members of your organization comfortable and able to work with these technologies. So when you look at these in total, establishing a CoE is really one way that you can think about managing these risks. So let's look at now what the CoE would do in terms of kind of the different ways it would go about operating from managing these particular risks. First and foremost, it would look at how you would define guidelines for managing the risk and establishing securities and privacy guidelines. Next, it would come up with the policies and procedures to determine how you're going to administer and roll out different solutions within your organization and establish that governance structure. Third, it's going to also take a look at what are the ways that you want to create reusable assets or automation in your solutions and kind of be that central knowledge hub within your organization for managing how you build solutions, how you harvest common patterns like an architecture patterns within your solutions, and bring those back to the organization so that you're constantly improving and constantly making yourself better as an organization in building and delivering generative AI solutions. And along with that is being that central knowledge repository of information, or providing that for understanding what are the key tools that enable you to build these solutions and how those tools are evolving over time. So with that, then what really is that CoE? What does that team look like? So what it looks like, again, it's a cross-functional team. It provides leadership, it provides best practices, it conducts research, and it really requires the knowledge and skills of all disciplines, whether that be from the business functional area, from your IT organization, again, from legal or talent when you're dealing with policy and privacy and security. It really needs to have representatives from all those disciplines. But really critical about a CoE is that it can't be an ivory tower organization. It must have team members and staff that allow it to participate in the active building of solutions within the organization so that it not only is providing guidance from the standpoint of best practices, but it's providing those best practices from actual real world experience. And that's really kind of the number one key component of an Azure CoE. Excuse me, Azure AI CoE. So now that we've reached the end of our session here, we'll now conclude, and then we'll get ready for part 2, where we'll kind of take what we've learned here and dive into the next section where we'll get into the key capabilities what are the roles, and then how you will get started with your CoE. Thank you all very much.